All right, everybody, ready to dive into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. We're going to be talking about discipline and power.
Ooh, sounds intense.
Oh, it is. It is. But trust me, this is going to be anything but a boring philosophy lecture.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
All right, so we're going deep into Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish,
A classic.
and we're going to explore how power operates, not just, in the big obvious ways like laws and stuff, but in these subtle, everyday techniques that actually shape us.
Okay, so like sneaky power moves.
Exactly. Sneaky power moves that shape our bodies and our behavior. You might be surprised by how much this stuff actually affects your life.
Oh yeah, I'm ready to have my mind blown.
So Foucault, he uses this really captivating example to kind of illustrate this point about discipline and power. He talks about the image of a soldier.
Like a brave warrior charging into battle.
Yeah, like that classic picture, like all battle-hardened, strong, the ideal warrior. But he contrasts that, 17th century ideal with the 18th century soldier.
Okay, so what's different about the 18th century soldier?
Well, instead of all that emphasis on, natural strength, this later soldier's more like a carefully constructed machine.
A machine.
Yeah, molded through, meticulous training, like every movement, every action, all precisely controlled.
Oh, I see. So it's less about individual strength and more about being part of a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. And it really makes you think about how our ideas of strength and power have, changed over time.
It's kind of like that shift from the individual hero to the disciplined army unit.
Yes. And that shift that you just mentioned is a perfect illustration of Foucault's concept of the docile body.
Docile body, huh? That sounds kind of ominous.
It is a little bit, right? But it's fascinating because it's not about brute force anymore, but about a body that's disciplined to become, get this, both economically productive
Productive?
and politically obedient.
Whoa. Okay, so it's like training people to be good workers and good citizens.
Yeah, basically. And it's almost like this paradox,
A
right?
paradox. How so?
Well, the very same techniques that increase a body's capabilities, right, make it more efficient, more productive, those also make it more subject to control.
Yeah, that is kind of paradoxical. You're making people more capable, but also more controllable.
Exactly. And Foucault, he gives all these specific examples to show how this works, from military training to, well, other institutions.
So, how do they actually make bodies docile? What are some of the techniques?
Well, think about it. Instead of focusing on a soldier's natural strength, right? There was this huge emphasis on posture and gaze in the 18th century.
Posture and gaze.
Yeah, soldiers would be drilled relentlessly to march with precise steps, heads held high, never looking at the ground.
Wow, that's intense. So it's all about control, even down to how they hold their bodies.
Absolutely. Every little detail. Control, control, control. And Foucault, he even connects this to some of the big ideas floating around in the 18th century, remember Lemaitrie's Man the Machine?
Oh, yeah, right. The idea that the human body is like a clockwork mechanism.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of the docile body really comes into focus. It's like the point where the physical body meets the political body.
So we're not just talking about physical discipline, but also shaping people's minds and beliefs.
You got it. It's about making people, manageable, in both body and mind.
This is getting pretty deep.
It is, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how this docile body thing works with, individuals. But Foucault, he takes it even further. He uses this really interesting example of how they dealt with, believe it or not, the plague.
The plague. What does that have to do with power?
Well, it's about how they used ideas of control and discipline to manage this public health crisis. And it kind of became like a blueprint, for broader disciplinary power.
So the plague was like a testing ground for these power techniques.
In a way, yeah, it's kind of creepy, actually.
Okay, I'm officially creeped out.
Well, what's interesting here is how Foucault points to the control of space, right, as a key element of power. During a plague outbreak back then, they had this meticulous partitioning of space. It was almost an obsession.
Partitioning of space.
Yeah, they'd shut down entire towns, divide them into quarters. Streets would be overseen by these syndics, watchmen.
So a total lockdown.
Pretty much. And Foucault, he describes all these chilling details about surveillance, everyone's confined, right? They're visible at their windows, they're constantly tracked, registered.
This is almost like a dystopian novel or something.
It does, doesn't it? And the thing is, it's not just about the plague, right?
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. Foucault connects this to all sorts of other examples of enclosure as a disciplinary technique.
Enclosure.
Yeah, think monasteries, military barracks, even the shift to to boarding schools.
Oh, I see. So it's about controlling people by controlling where they are, how they move, who they interact with.
Precisely. It's like a very spatial form of power, like using physical space to shape behavior.
It's like if you control the space, you control the people in it.
Exactly. And what's super fascinating is how this idea of enclosure, right, how it kind of evolves over time.
How so?
Well, it becomes less about like physical walls, and more about controlling movement and placement within institutions like factories, for example.
So the techniques become more subtle, but no less effective.
Exactly. It's like power gets sneakier, more sophisticated over time.
That's kind of scary.
It is, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about space, but Foucault also points out this other fascinating detail. The concept of rank, right, becomes like this key unit of control.
Rank, like first place, second place, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating a hierarchy, and using that hierarchy to manage people.
Okay, so how does rank work as a disciplinary technique?
Well, he uses the evolution of classrooms as an example.
Classrooms.
Yeah, so picture this, right? Early classrooms, they were these chaotic spaces. Students were basically like jousting with each other, no real order.
So like total anarchy.
Pretty much. But then classrooms become these ordered rows, assigned seating, grades, age-based progression, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, so it went from chaos to order
Yeah.
with everyone in their designated place.
Exactly. And that's how rank works as a disciplinary technique. It's about creating a system with clear levels and hierarchies.
So everyone knows their place, and there's a clear path for advancement. Sounds kind of like a lot of organizations today.
It does, doesn't it? And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you see how discipline, how it aims to create interchangeable individuals.
Interchangeable.
Yeah, it's not so much about your unique talents anymore, right? But about your designated place in the system.
So it's about fitting into the system rather than standing out.
Exactly. And that's a pretty powerful idea, right? How discipline can shape not just our bodies, but how we think about ourselves, our place in the world.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much of our individuality is actually shaped by these invisible systems of discipline.
Right. And speaking of shaping, we've talked about space, but what about time? Like, how does the control of time factor into all of this?
Oh, good point. Time is a huge factor, isn't it? We're all kind of ruled by the clock these days.
We are, aren't we? And Foucault, he talks about this shift, this really significant shift from natural rhythms, like sunrise, sunset, to these strictly regulated schedules.
So instead of following the natural flow of time, we're now bound by these artificial time structures.
Exactly. And it's not just, about setting a schedule, right? It's about breaking time down into smaller and smaller, more manageable units.
Right, like we're obsessed with productivity hacks and time management apps.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly trying to optimize our time, but maybe we're also, reinforcing these disciplinary structures without even realizing it.
It's like we've internalized the clock.
We have, haven't we? Okay, so speaking of efficiency, Foucault, he mentions this really interesting fact about how military training evolved.
Tell me more.
Well, it shifted, right? It went from having soldiers copy an exemplary action, like a perfect model.
So like learning by imitation.
Yeah, exactly. But then it shifted to breaking down movements into these elementary gestures.
Interesting. So instead of copying the whole, you break it down into parts.
Exactly. And by doing that, you gain like this incredible level of control over the body.
It's like those old time and motion studies, where they'd analyze every tiny movement a worker made to make the process more efficient.
Yes. It's like a choreography of control, every movement planned and prescribed.
Exactly. And Foucault, he calls this the creation of these complex disciplinary polyphonies of exercises.
Disciplinary polyphonies. Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is, right. But it perfectly captures this idea of precision and control, like a symphony of disciplined movements.
Okay, so we've seen how discipline, right, how it shapes the body in space and time, but it doesn't stop there, does it? Foucault, he argues that this control, it extends to how we judge and evaluate individuals within these systems.
So it's not just about controlling bodies, but also about controlling minds.
Exactly. It's about shaping how we think, how we see ourselves, even how we see others.
Okay, now it's getting really interesting.
And to illustrate this point, he brings up this rather startling example, the shameful class at the École Militaire.
The shameful class. What's that?
Well, it was basically this group of students at a military academy in 18th century France who were singled out for not being disciplined enough.
So like The kids who got sent to detention?
Yeah, something like that. And this example, it perfectly illustrates Foucault's idea of normalizing judgment.
Normalizing judgment.
Yeah, it's the idea that discipline, right, it isn't just about punishing bad behavior.
So it's not just about rewards and punishments.
Exactly. It's more insidious than that. It's about creating hierarchies, right? Hierarchies of good and bad subjects.
So it's about judging a person's very nature, not just their actions.
Exactly. It's like, are you a disciplined person or are you, one of the undisciplined? It's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
It is, and it makes you wonder if we're still doing that today, judging people based on how well they fit into the system.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Credit scores, performance reviews, even social media likes.
Right. They all contribute to this sense of being constantly evaluated and categorized.
We are, aren't we? Like we're all living in this invisible system of rewards and punishments, right? Based on how well we conform.
It's like we're all in this shameful class, just trying to avoid being singled out.
Whoa, that's a powerful image.
It is, isn't it? And speaking of systems, Foucault, he makes this really surprising connection between the meticulous records they kept in 18th century hospitals.
Yeah, all those charts and files.
Exactly. And what he calls the ignoble archives of modern power.
The ignoble archives, huh? So like our data trails.
Yeah, basically all those records and files that document our lives,
Mm.
from medical records to credit reports.
Okay, so what's the connection between like 18th century hospital records and modern day data collection?
Yeah.
What makes them ignoble?
Well, it's about how these seemingly mundane documents, right, they
Yeah.
become tools of power.
Tools of power, but how? They just seem like, information, record.
It's the thing, right? It's subtle. Foucault argues that there's this shift from, from traditional displays of power, like public executions and stuff, to these more subtle forms of control.
Or subtle.
Yeah, through examination and documentation. It's like
Yeah.
instead of punishing the body directly, you create this detailed record of the individual.
So you're saying like instead of physically punishing someone, you control them by collecting information about them.
Exactly. You turn them into a case, right? A case to be studied, analyzed, and managed.
It's like the ultimate form of surveillance, knowing everything about someone.
It is, and it makes me think of, medical records, psychological profiles, even those files they keep on students.
It's like we're constantly being documented and categorized, turned into data points.
We are, aren't we? And this links back to that idea of the docile body, making people manageable, controllable through these systems.
It's kind of creepy when you think about it.
It is, right. Okay, so all of this leads us to one of Foucault's his most famous and thought-provoking ideas, the panopticon.
The panopticon. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It kind of does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's actually a real thing, or at least it was a design for a prison.
A prison.
Yeah, picture this. A central tower surrounded by a ring of cells with this constant feeling of visibility, like someone could be watching you at any moment.
So like Big Brother.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the key thing about the panopticon, right, is that it doesn't actually matter if someone's watching you all the time.
Wait, so what's the point then, if no one's actually watching?
Well, the point is to induce a state of self-surveillance.
Self-surveillance?
Yeah.
Like spying on yourself?
Kinda, yeah. It's like you start regulating your own behavior because you assume you're always being observed.
Oh, I get it. So it's like, even if you don't know if someone's watching, you act as if they are.
Exactly. And that's what makes the panopticon such a powerful metaphor for how power operates in modern society.
It's funny because I was just thinking about all those security cameras we see everywhere and all the data tracking that's happening online.
Right. And that feeling of being constantly watched, even when you're alone.
It's like the panopticon has become like a reality.
It has, hasn't it? And what's even more unsettling, right, is that the panopticon, this model of power, it aims to make power more efficient and more productive.
Efficient and productive. How does surveillance make things more productive?
Well, think about it. If everyone is constantly monitoring themselves, right, making sure they're following the rules, being good citizens, then the system runs more smoothly.
It's like a self-perpetuating system of control.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it links discipline, all those techniques we talked about, to this idea of social progress.
So we're all supposed to be disciplined and productive for the good of society.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
And if we don't, well, there's always that feeling of being watched, judged, categorized.
It's like we're all trapped in this giant panopticon.
In a way, yeah. And the question is, if we're so caught up in this system, how do we even recognize it? How do we challenge something that's so pervasive?
That's a good question because it can feel pretty overwhelming, right? Like, okay, I see the system now, but how do I change it?
That's the challenge Foucault presents us with, and there's no easy answer.
So, what can we do? Like, how do we break free from the panopticon?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's tough. But I think one of the most important things we can take away from Foucault is this. Power isn't just something, forced on us from above.
Okay, so it's not all about the man controlling us, right? It's more complicated.
Way more complicated. Power is everywhere in our relationships at work, even in how we think about ourselves.
So we're all kind of participating in these power dynamics, even if we don't realize it.
Exactly. And recognizing that, that's the first step.
Okay, but what do we do with that knowledge? It can feel a little overwhelming, honestly. Like, okay, I see the system, but how do I actually change anything?
Yeah, that's a challenge, and there's no easy answer.
Figures.
But one thing we can do is start questioning things, like all those norms and assumptions we take for granted.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, like, why do we do things this way? Who benefits from these systems, these structures? Are there other ways to organize our lives, our societies, things like that?
So it's about developing like a more critical awareness, right, of the world around us and how power is actually working in our everyday lives.
Exactly.
Okay. But awareness is one thing, action is another. How do we go from seeing the system to actually changing it?
Well, that critical awareness can lead to action, even if it's something small, like questioning a rule or speaking up against something that's unfair.
Small acts of rebellion.
Right. Or it could be bigger, like joining a movement or pushing for policies to change.
So it's about becoming more active and engaged citizens, not just, passively accepting whatever the system throws at us.
I like that. I think that's a great way to put it.
Foucault wouldn't want us to be docile bodies, would he?
Definitely not.
Mm.
His work's a reminder that we have the power to shape our world, but we need to be aware of the forces that are shaping us first.
Deep stuff.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive, I gotta say. I feel like I've learned so much about how power works in these sneaky ways and how it affects our lives, even when we don't realize it.
Me too.
Hmm?
And I think it's a conversation we should all be having, if we want to create a better world.
Absolutely. And to our listener out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. We've explored all these ideas from Foucault about discipline, power, the ways they shape everything around us. But this is just the beginning, right? Like, what are you going to do with this new understanding? How will you apply it to your own life? That's something to think about.